one disadvantage of jobs like ours is that we find ourselves in faraway places when sometimes good things and sometimes bad things happen. So I heard about Tony's passing when I was in Ethiopia, and so I couldn't join the service for him. So I'm really happy that we have this occasion to come and talk about Tony, those of us who knew him, and all of you are his close friends. I'm going to start just a few remarks, and then I'll invite you all to share your views or your thoughts about Tony. I came to the bank in 1972, a long time back, as a young professional. I was a failed academic. I had wanted to get a job in academia, but there were not jobs to be had, so I looked up this place called the World Bank, and confession, I didn't know much about poverty and all that, so I thought I'm going to do research. And but after coming here, one of the early persons I met was Tony, and he headed a division called Transport Research Division, a division that fitted very well on the surface with what I was trying to do. So I walked into Tony's office and I said, hey, I am such and such, and he said, okay, come join me. So I decided to spend my second YP assignment in Tony's division. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I saw Tony as a professional and as a friend, as a mentor to me, and by narrating a couple of instances, because we stayed in touch throughout his and my career in the bank. So as I joined the Transport Research Division, I'd barely been there for 3 or 4 days, and a letter arrives on my desk marked by Tony, can you do something about it? It was a letter from the President of Gabon to McNamara, and accompanied by a letter from the President of France at the time, which I've forgotten who it was. It was not Mitterrand, somebody else was the French president, asking the bank to support a railroad for extracting the timber. So I didn't know much about it, and Tony introduced me to likes of Alan Walters and Ezra Banathan and all that. And I did some research, and sure enough, it didn't make any sense. And as I wrote a note in those days, I thought, sure, this is going to be the end of my career, right? Because we said this railroad doesn't make any sense. And Tony was the kind of manager, he immediately took it and looked at it, said this makes sense, and sent it on to McNamara. That was Tony. Didn't worry about repercussions. I think Tony always was a believer in professionalism. Do what you think is right. I had a very similar experience shortly thereafter, which was also a negative one, because in those days UNCTAD was arguing very strongly that the developing countries got a share of shipping, because all these shipping lines were dominated by industrialized countries. And Ezra Banathan at that time had become an advisor, and I talked to Ezra, and Tony gave me as a second job, and again my conclusion was it's a waste of money. And again, as usual. So it really left an impression on me that Tony was, as a manager, respected analytical work, professionalism, and what have you. So I really left a mark. The other thing about Tony, which I always remembered, and I tried to practice when I became a manager, was he was very quick. You give him a piece of paper, and you can see Tony lying down on his couch, his back used to always hurt him. And by the end of the day or the next day, he would have looked at it and given you some very insightful comments, very brief, very to the point, and often from this is excellent to have you thought about this. So very, I think, a trait that I admired in Tony. But the one that left a big impression on me was I had become a manager, and there was a person in my division who I didn't think was doing very well. And he knew Tony also, and so I had lunch with Tony, and I asked Tony, what do you think? What should I do? Because if this person is not living up to what I think we expect. And Tony's question was not to ask me details or so on. He said, have you given him an opportunity to succeed? And it was a good question. And I think that was Tony's approach, that you try to get the best you can out of people. So these are some of the recollections, and I'm sure others will have more. But one last thing I want to say is early on when I worked with Tony, his first wife at the time, Darlene, passed away prematurely. and all of us were quite concerned. He had a young family. I think Christopher was in Tony's arms, if I remember correctly, at the time. So he had a very young family, and it was a concern to all of us that how would Tony manage this. And then I must say, Joan came into his life, and that was probably Tony would not mind my saying so. That was a great occasion for him, and Tony was. I even seem to think his backache disappeared after that. But so no, he continued. I know, but at least he looked happier, and I think that was a big impression, Joan, you made on his life, and I think we're all grateful for that. So,
and like in there, I met sort of Tony around 1970, but I met him for the first time being outside the bank. I was in academia, and sort of rather young, late 20s, and then I get a call to see if I wanted to do an evaluation of the benefits of rural electrification. So, I said, my goodness, how the hell do you... So I accepted that. I thought it was very challenging, but it was a very stimulating, sort of to have that sort of opportunity. And I met Tony in that context for the first time, and then I joined the bank maybe 2-3 years later. But it was sort of an extremely interesting experience to work with him and to articulate that issue, and then for him to convince a young guy sort of like that we could apply sort of economic techniques into a relevant problem. So that was sort of my first time I met Tony from the outside in a very challenging, and then I had to sort of fly to rural El Salvador many times and calculate how much people are willing to pay for a cold Coca-Cola vis-a-vis a non-cold Coca-Cola, and that would be achieved by by refrigeration, a lot of imaginative things together with Dennis Anderson. But what I will do is that I became friend with Tony over the next 20 years. I did never work directly with him because I was not in project. I was more research and policy, and even sometimes I worked in competing departments in which many times we were confronted, but in a good way. But then I appreciated even more to have him as a friend and as a colleague. Okay, and what I will just I'm going to talk about sort of some more general attributes, because some of you work with him in more specific sectors, and you have perhaps much better information about his specific contribution in your respective sectors. But there were some sort of general features about Tony that I thought they were extremely attractive and important. First of all, he was a very committed man. It was no BS. He was really committed. He was also very courageous, something that you just mentioned, okay? In the sense that he would many times confront facts and many times also bureaucratic facts, and that was not easy, okay? It's worse today probably, but at that time it was not easy either. And he was always very intellectually curious, versatile, very versatile. Interested in clarifying when there was confusion, for example. Again, I will give you some examples. Great colleague, a lot of flair to work with young people, and I see many of all that people here, and I will mention areas. Okay, the ability to encourage people to work with him in applying sort of economics to very interesting problems, and I thought that was sort of a very, very unique, because the bank at that time was not applying modern economics to many of the issues of infrastructure. For example, I wrote down here, because I went back I Googled Tony again, okay, and I went through all the work that he had done, not all of them, it's impossible, but all the issues of pricing, congestion, mobilized willingness to pay, regulatory issues to mobilize private sector development, in ports and electricity, in roads, all that wave of analytical work trying to apply economics into many issues of this sort in the infrastructure was something very, very, very interesting. And in the process, he was able to mobilize a lot of world talent. David Newberry came, Alan Walters, Ezra Benathan, and then Munasinghe. Very bright people like Greg Ingram, Dennis Anderson, Johannes Linn, who worked with him. So he mobilized a lot of very interesting people to work with him in very interesting applied issues, and that was not common at that time to engage sort of people who were just coming from academia and to integrate them in policy issues that were quite relevant. The other thing of Tony is that he always also kept the broad picture. He didn't sort of stick to necessarily to very micro issues in a sector, but he kept also a view of trying to understand where there were some controversies or when he saw that there were some fads or misleading. For example, he did some very important work on trying to project the future of energy prices and the energy market over time. Okay? And that was at the time when the Club of Rome was very, very important. And the Club of Rome was a group of intellectuals who had a very negative, a very sort of a pessimism about that the world was going to run out of resources, particularly energy. And then Tony wrote this very important paper in which he brought in the role of technical change, of substitution, and all of the things that we see today. He brought them in already, I think that was in the late 90s, okay? And the Club of Rome was very important and very, there was somebody called Baltimore, very important men, I remember that. Then, again, under McNamara, the issue of poverty, and all the emphasis was on rural poverty, okay? And a lot of the emphasis was, according to that time, to combat rural poverty, you have rural projects, okay? You have a poor farmer here, you give them assets. But then Tony said, people move. There's migration, there is mobility. These people are going to move to urban areas eventually. Maybe what we should give them is human capital instead of just physical projects, okay? That was not obvious at the time. And so he started thinking about that and developed the urban agenda and the urban basic needs, etc. And then he expanded it to the city study, mobilizing people like Michael Cohen, Bayer, Bertrand Renault, Greg. The other area in which he started working was in global warming. He wrote a very important article of global warming that appears in Financial Development early on in the 90s. And finally, and as important, were his personal attributes. He was a kind person, always ready to listen. Many times he was caught in very tough bureaucratic crossfire involving reorganizations, which were very, very tough, in which he probably had to make very tough decisions, and he was basically caught in the middle. And let me just finish by saying that, he was a wonderful friend. He has left us with a great legacy, but most important, with a wonderful family.
Tony was my boss in the central project in the urban and water supply department for 3 years. And I was with two of my colleagues, Mike Cohen and Harold Duckerley, his advisor and manager. I don't want to talk about his achievements because it has been already said that how much he was contributing to with policies, transport, poverty, and energy, etc. Because that's not what I want to stress today. I want to stress on two things: his quality as a manager and his quality as a friend. Okay. And by quality of a manager, I believe that there are two qualities that are inherent to a good manager. The first one is to listen and to, let's say, be informed of what is happening in the surrounding environment, which was the World Bank, of course. And the second quality is how to recruit good staff. And he wasn't boss particularly habilitated to this. And let me give you some examples. Before I joined the department, I was looking at, of course, myself to what was happening in the bank, and I would see, and I did not know him before, I would see Tony going every morning at lunchtime to a table, which was a table for a manager, and he would sit down and talk and listen to what was happening in the bank. And I thought that was an excellent way of being informed. And the very next morning at 8 o'clock, he had a meeting with his three advisors, put it this way, and he would tell us what was happening in the bank. So that was a quality, I think, which impressed me at that time and still impressed me. That's for the question of being informed. The second question is how he was very, very well trained, let's say, to select the best people ever. I want to read a quote here, which says, when you have he would say always, when you have a position to fill in any organization, be it on private or the private sector or the public sector, you do not spend your precious time trying to find the candidate responding perfectly to the job description, but you choose the candidate who has the best record of accomplishment and human qualities. And I think this is perfect. You don't try to fit exactly the position, you take the best people. And let me give you some names that people he has selected, and I'm sure that my list is not exhaustive. Alan Walter was, during his time, part of his team. Callisto Malavo was, I replaced Callisto Malavo, he was before me with, but Callisto Malavo became, as you know, Vice President Africa. How not about David DeFerranti. David DeFerranti was in our department, and he becomes Vice President Latin America. He had 13, or I don't know how many, I was managing this advisor. We had 13 top-level quality advisors. And I would mention only, let's say, Carlo Rietveld, or Alo Sorov, or Tony Pellegrini, or Inder Sud. He was also division chief at the time. All these people, he had let's say, he was keen to attract them and to have a team of work, either in his department or expanding towards the region. So that's why I thought he was a good manager. Tony had also other quality, and he had a good sense of humor. And maybe you have not lived with him, but I was living with him, and he was a good sense of humor, very open to listen, as I said before, and he was very cool. He never lost his temper. You could tell him anything. He was very, very quiet. So I want to give you two examples, which are very specific, but I think they are typical of what one could say. Tony will go to a conference like today, for instance. He would make a speech, and a good speech in general. But then all of a sudden he would stand up like this. He would go to the camera and he would say, "Hello, ma'am." That was his. I think it was very, very nice of him. Another example I want. We would go with him to conferences outside the town, and he would say, "Well, I don't want to use any." He wanted to drive up the limit of the threshold. And he would say, "Well, I don't want to purchase a radar detector, but I have this radio," and he had a radio which was able to communicate with the truck drivers in the road, So we were listening about the truck drivers. It was very fun because you say, yeah, there is. So that was another example. Now, I want to stress as a last point something which I kept it in my heart. It was one of the Christmas time, end of the year time. And Tony had made a party at home, and he was receiving us. And he was having in his arm his daughter, the smallest one. I don't know if you heard that. And it was very good because he was very proud. He was very proud. It shows how much he loved his family, his wife, and his children. And I will finish with this. Thank you very much.
I met Tony in 1977 when I joined the bank, and he, although he worked in the Transport Research Division, he spent most of his career in operations. But he also had an important impact and a continuing impact on research, and I wanted to mention that briefly, and that is when Hollis Chenery became chief economist of the bank, he set up a research committee to advise him on research policies and directions, and also about the funding of particular projects. And Hollis sort of very politically wisely had people from operations mostly on that committee, and they were people in operations who typically had some kind of research experience. And Tony was on that committee for a very long time, where he added a tremendous amount of value. he promoted a lot of urban research in that period as well, and of which I was a beneficiary. He was trained as an economist, and he practiced the craft really well. People have already mentioned, one of the things about Tony was Tony had this incredible calmness. I mean, you mentioned, it was really hard to upset Tony. Whatever outrageous thing you would bring to him, he would, oh, that's very interesting. You get this kind of mellow view from him. And he was competent, and he brought this competence and rationality to discussions not only of research, where he was on the research committee and able to do that, but also to discussions of policies in transport, urban development, energy, and industry. That said, I mean, he was the sort of economist who really did economics. And so a lot of times people were very surprised about what he would say about his position on issues, because these positions typically, came out of sort of underlying economic principles. And at the same time, he carried with him a real skepticism about bureaucracy, both banks' bureaucracy and other bureaucracies. And he wasn't a Chicago boy, which is to say a believer in market mechanisms and to the end of the earth. But he brought a kind of skepticism and a bit of contrarianism with him. He was a good person to talk to about ideas. You come up with an idea, go talk to Tony, because it was difficult to predict what he'd say. And he had this skepticism and this contrarianism. But once you got him convinced, he became a terrific advocate and a very constructive ally. I benefited from that working on urban research. I have to say, with all of this competence in economics, I spent 2 years as the economic advisor to the Urban Projects Department when he was there, which was a bit daunting since Tony knew the game and sort of kept me on my toes. The other final comment I want to make about Tony was one of the things I learned in the bank, or just in general in life, there are, this is an oversimplification, but in the world there are steep hierarchy people and flat hierarchy people. And by that I mean steep hierarchy people view the people above them as people to be venerated and respected, and people below them often barely worth talking to, and flat hierarchy people see everybody as pretty much the same. Tony was very much of a flat hierarchy person. In fact, he was almost a reverse hierarchy person in the sense that he was very good at letting his bosses know when they were saying foolish things. And he had an ability to speak truth to power, not just in sending memos up to McNamara and so on, but also many of us who were at meetings with Tony would see him sort of reach out and kind of correct the person running the meeting, or ask, so what are we going to do next? So if we do this, what happens next? Much to the annoyance of the person running the meeting. So I always admired that about him, and I have had the pleasure of having him as a friend and a mentor at the bank, and actually in the scheme of things, a neighbor in Maryland. So I've benefited tremendously from knowing him. Thank you very much.
And I suppose it's appropriate for me to say a word after the economic advisor, because I was Tony's financial advisor for much of the time he was the director. In order to be his financial advisor, I was, for my sins, an accountant and still am. And many people say that accountants are bookkeepers trying to become economists. So I did try very hard, but fitting into an economic enterprise as an accountant wasn't always the easiest thing to do. And sometimes if you people looked at accounting, they would say, oh, that's just bookkeeping, or that's just accounting. What you have to do is to look at the big picture, or something like that. But I remember Tony as being very kind to me and supportive of me in at least a couple of things which were outside of his normal responsibility, you might say, as an economist or a bank manager. Inder mentioned that he was abroad when he heard about Tony's tragic death. I was abroad, halfway around the world with my wife, when I heard about the tragic death 33 years ago of my son, who was killed in a motor accident. And Tony was the person who had to help, advise, and manage a very distraught person, get him back from Thailand, and help me to deal with the circumstances of my son's death. Plus, with my connection with my family in the United Kingdom, we had to organize something so that I could go and share some of my family grief with my own mother and father. And Tony used every bit of his managerial skill to make sure that I could get organized in whatever way was most suitable, and he gave me time off and rearranged my home leave and everything that could be possibly helpful to me, and I was ever grateful for that. The other thing that I think Tony has to take a lot of credit for, even though I was the prime mover, I was privileged to write a book on accounting. It turned out eventually to be 900 pages. And just the other day somebody said, gee, it's as long as the Bible. So I actually checked against the Bible, and it's not as long as the Bible. It gets past the Gospel of Mark. But it's a great pride and joy to me, and it would not have been achieved at all if Tony had not allowed me to work flexibly and efficiently by stopping off in London, meeting with my institute people who were the editors of the book, coming back and going forth and rearranging my journeys. And so in many ways this book is well, you might say it's a credit to my work, but it's also a credit to his management and also his vision, as many have said, in letting this go forward as something which he regarded as helpful to the department. And there is a nice twist to this at the very end, because people would look at this huge book and say, yeah, well, that's all right, Dave, but can't you write something a little less long and a summary or something? Well, I think it was after the bank that I decided to look into this, and I discovered a couple of things. One is, accounting, unlike engineering and economics and all the other wonderful things we do, is not rocket science. You can boil it down to about 40 or so book entries, and that's the end of it. The other thing I discovered is that all of these book entries can be diagrammed on a single page. And so I put all these book entries, debits and credits, what kind of things they were, assets and liabilities and everything, on a single page. And then I said to myself, what should I call this? And I thought about history and Winston Churchill, who was accustomed to saying during World War II, pray let me have on one sheet of paper all the information you can about the enemy submarine deployment. So I thought, okay, I'll call it a Churchill chart. And so, in a way, in honor of the name of Churchill, if not exactly the person, we have a Churchill chart with everything you wanted to know about accounting, but were afraid to ask, on one sheet of paper. The other thing that I'm obviously got to thank Tony for is that even though in me he inherited a headache, I did not actually inherit his backache, but I did inherit his couch. It came into my office when I took over as financial advisor because I think no one else knew where to put it, and Tony at that time had ceased to use it on a regular basis, so it stayed with me for most of the time. So gifts from Tony to me were strange, perhaps, and different, but I remember him most of all as a thoroughly decent person and a very competent manager. Thank you.
And I began working with the bank as a consultant in 1981-82 at the request of a man named David Beckman, who was a TTL in LAC, and he asked me to live in slum areas of La Paz and Guayaquil to understand the perspective of the people who were supposedly receiving benefits from the World Bank projects in those two areas. At that time, I didn't know Tony. He was, at that time, I believe, the director of urban projects. But I just was down there. It was the first time that the bank had ever asked anyone to live in a project area and try to understand the perspective of the people, which I felt was a good thing to do and the right thing to do. But it was innovative and untried. And I was there kind of alone, writing these reports on what the people were thinking about these upgrading projects or new housing projects. And after a while, when I came back to the bank every 4 or 5 months, Tony began to ask to see me. And he said, well, you know, I'm getting these reports and they're interesting. There's something going on here that's worth noting. I'm sending them around to the various sector managers just so they can look at them. And I was very encouraged with that because it was a very lonely kind of an occupation. And later, once that work was done, Tony helped to kind of sponsor this work by overseeing various presentations to different parts of the bank about what it meant to do participant observer evaluate, to get feedback from people by getting to know them and seeing what they felt. What this has to do with what's been set up to now, I think it means that certainly Tony was not hierarchical in the sense that he was listening, he cared about listening to the people themselves, not just about people above him, but certainly about people below him. He was not a strict economist, although he may have been a very good one, in as much as he did care about, he was a humanist, I think, in many ways. And my neighbor was saying something about his human qualities with the tragedy he went through. And I think Tony had a very human quality about him, which was beautiful. And he was willing to support innovation. And I'll always be extremely grateful for what he did. That's it.
I was very fortunate to work with Tony, like many of us around the table, and I think my memories of Tony are very much similar to what we just heard. And the word innovation, I think, was one that, as we know, at the World Bank was not always very popular. But I think for those of us who had some new ideas, Tony created this environment where we could go to him and we could come up with the craziest ideas, and I did my share. I think one of them might have been starting something called the Natural Gas Development Group, and he was like, do it. So, you know, gas has come back, so sounds like Tony was ahead of everyone else. And I think, 2 or 3 characteristics of Tony that I would say are important. One is the innovation that we just heard about. 2 was his humanity. And, as we all know, he and Joan were a wonderful family, and both very high achieving with a great family. But he brought me and his other colleagues into his family, and I learned a lot about, good situations, not good situations, and how you create a family. And I was sort of at that stage in my life when I was starting to think about that. And he was really critical in terms of the fact that you can do this, and under all circumstances, it's important, and the family is really important. And for those of us who are very directed towards our work, he reminded us that having a family was important. He also made me feel like I was part of his family, and he and Joan were always opening their doors to those of us who worked with Tony, and I was very fortunate. The third thing I should mention is that at the time when Tony was director of Energy Department, which is when I worked for him, the subject of women was not something that was as popular as it is today. Maybe today we talk about it too much. In those days we didn't talk about it at all. And being a woman and working in the bank was not always the easiest thing. And Tony really made it easy. And when there were difficulties, he dealt with them. And he was really tough when he needed to. So this very gentle, wonderful human being who we know would, I think he made a huge difference in my case and other women who work with him. And I'm forever grateful to Tony. And I think he and Joan had a very important role in my life and my family's life.
I arrived in the bank as a young professional in 1981. I think it was one of those first years where the bank had decided to hire 1/3 of women among the YPs. And I felt very much that it was brought in because they needed a bunch of ladies, and I was okay, but certainly Tony Churchill made a difference, and he nominated me and another lady. I was at the time in urban development in Latin America. He nominated us to training for women leadership. And my first reaction, very typically at the time, was, what is that? Am I sick, or am I, do I need fixing in addition to being a woman? What is it I need that others don't have? And I was not too happy about it. And Tony looked at me, and I think many years later, I came to appreciate that his look meant, your reaction perhaps shows you need it. So I think he knew, I would like to say that that training first made an immense difference to my life, because it gave me a conceptual framework to understand what it was to be a minority and to be different, and how women achieved and how women failed, and that it was not a matter of me, but it was a matter of the system that was, that needed work. And I think through this attention to training young women, he certainly made a big difference, and certainly for my capacity to function in the bank. Thank you.
After the 1980, whatchamacallit, reorganization, okay. Yeah. Tony and I ended up as directors in the same department, the same vice presidency, and we had weekly staff meetings, which were, words fail me, boring, difficult, useless, no fun at all. And most of us sat around like school kids and wrote notes to each other and made jokes with each other during the meetings. Tony continued to take them seriously and to try to join in constructively in the discussion, thereby scaring me to death. I mean, he was serious and he was substantive, and I felt like a kid, a silly kid. But every now and again, we won. Things got so bad that Tony would join in the note writing and joke making campaign. So I did know that there was a strong human streak there as well. And then something wonderful happened. I left the bank. I bought a house in Rehoboth Beach, and as luck would have it, that house was right across the street from Tony and Joan's house. And I got to know an entirely different Tony Churchill, the one that so many of you have been talking about. A relaxed, funny, human, warm, terrific, laid back, artistic. I knew about the artistic part due to all the episodes about the paintings in his office, but just a totally different, warm, relaxed human being. And that was the Tony that I've known for the past 10 years, and the Joan that brought it out in him. And it was just marvelous. So I have to say that I saw both Tonys, and they were both admirable. Totally.
I first came to the bank in 1975 as a temporary research assistant in a unit that was established because Mr. McNamara decided to give a speech on urban poverty. And at the time, I had a newly minted MBA from American University, which I got at night, in real estate and urban planning, and they needed somebody with some sort of background in that area. So I worked on that for a few months. Tony was one of the people that interviewed me and hired me for this job. And then I, kind of moved into other tasks that were concerned with urban poverty. I was a temporary research assistant, and at the time, the bank was not only completely male-dominated, but there was a huge gap between the research assistant category, which was considered support staff, and professional. Well, 3 years later, I'd done a number of things in operations, etc., and I believe that Tony was one of the people that supported me for a professional position in the bank, which was very unusual because I don't think I had the kind of sterling academic credentials that other people had, and I was also a woman with a family, by the way, young children, but he supported that, and I was able to move up in the bank, and it's made a huge difference in my life. So I never really worked that much with Tony, but I'm eternally grateful for his non-hierarchical and humane attitude toward people.
I would also like to briefly express my own appreciation for Tony and his contributions. I was fortunate to meet Tony early in my bank career, and very fortunate that he took an interest in me and my career. He became a valued mentor, and I particularly enjoyed our lunches together. We used to have lunch quite regularly, where we discussed everything from the intricacies of cost-benefit analysis for a wide range of projects and other aspects of bank work to political developments in Nicaragua, which is my home country, my country of origin. Tony was interested in everything. As I think Marcelo indicated, the range of his interests was truly admirable. And I also admired both his intellectual rigor and no-nonsense approach, but in a very human way. He would tell you when something was, not up to par, but he would do so in a way that was not off-putting. He was truly an exceptional person, and I very much enjoyed working with him and knowing him in the bank. I also want to mention one other thing. I appreciated Tony's strong support to me when I left the bank on leave without pay to complete my PhD at Berkeley and to work for my home government in Nicaragua. And after Kim Jaycock's initial strong endorsement, which was unusual actually because the bank did not encourage people to do this, and after the initial support from Kim for this leave without pay, I needed the reentry guarantee at various times, for the extension. And Tony was unbelievable because you can imagine the personnel department at this point hated me because I was breaking all the precedents in terms of my leave. I ended up being away from the bank for 5 years. And Tony was instrumental in ensuring that I had that reentry guarantee, because he felt that I should be lured back to the bank. I mean, he really liked me. He took a liking to me, and he wanted to ensure that I came back to the bank. And I will always be grateful to him for that, and I will always remember him very fondly.
I came to the bank as a YP in 1973. I came straight out of university. Wouldn't happen today, but it happened then. As a macroeconomist, macro and trade economist, I was put into the old urban policy division with Doug Keir and Roy Ball, and started off in an area, had absolutely no clue what it was all about, but for 6 months I was doing urban public finance, and Tony was in that half year, and then beyond that, not as a manager, but just as a person who was there with this incredibly intellectual capacity as an economist that we've heard so much about already, but also with his, what Greg called his, I guess, flat management style. For me, as a young, inexperienced economist, he listened to when he really didn't have a reason to listen. He guided, he was a mentor, he was a human being that took interest, personal as well as substantive and professional interest. And I must say, I hadn't really thought much about it for the last 30, 40 years. But as I now look back, he was clearly one of the people that was critical in turning me into what I became and who I am. So thank you, Tony.
Unlike most of the speakers so far, I do not belong to the infrastructure sector, and I have not had really, during his professional career, I did not have any opportunity to work with Tony Churchill. My association with Tony was really after he had retired from the bank, and as when I was working in Quag myself, and Tony, really two things I remember about Tony from that association. One, he was any time a complex urban project came, Tony was our most preferred panelist to be put into that panel, because everybody respected him for his professional standing and his ability to really cut through the crap and come to the basic issues. So we really appreciated very much to have Tony on the that sort of a group in terms of those reviews of the projects. And secondly, I really like the fact very much that Tony had the ability to call a spade, while still not turning the tap off and making somebody really piss off. You know, convey the tough messages, but to do it in a fashion where the other side would still be receptive to having that message. That was really a skill which unfortunately most of us don't have. You know, we either we butted on the message or we turn off the people. Tony was able to really navigate that business in his fashion where he would convey exactly what he wanted to convey, but still, have the other party feel good about it. So, thank you.
I didn't work with Tony Churchill directly. I'm kind of like Prem's situation, where I didn't actually work in urban or any of the research areas, but I was, a while back, a young professional program administrator. I joined as a YP, and pretty much around the time that Inder came, and I had the privilege of recruiting, up to about 100 young professionals. And one of the things about young professionals at the time is that they were highly sought after. They were free commodities. The budget was funded by HR, and they were very bright, very good. One huge gap, of course, is the gender gap. We didn't have a whole lot of women in the groups that I recruited back in 1972, 74. So, but one of the things that I recall about Tony is that as one of the managers requesting YPs, there are three types. One is somebody says, I just want the best. I want only your best. I don't want any of the other ones. The other ones are saying, well, let me look at the catalog of 100 and see what they look like. And then there's the other. And the thing about being a YP administrator is you've got a lot of people who are really good, but there's always some people with issues, problems. Whether it's a cultural thing, whether it's a professional misfit, but somehow they don't quite click. And you have, back in those days, a year to 6 months assignment, and you could float away. And Tony was one of the people that I noticed, many of you talked about it, is the humanity in the side of it. And unlike a lot of bank managers, he actually took a great interest in those who weren't necessarily at the cutting point, at the top tier. And I would actually be able to talk to Tony and say, well, you know, we've got people, and I'm not serious, but I have some of my former YPs like Peter Scherer and who else? Yvonne was too young, but anyway, I would talk about it, and he would actually think it through. And I think what Inder said earlier about, you know, putting them in a situation where they can succeed, and that philosophy just permeated our discussions. So I found it very easy to go to Tony Churchill and say, you know, I've got a couple of YPs that I think you might want to be interested in, and he would look at it. I mean, he wouldn't necessarily take them always, but he would look at it and say, well, you know, you might think about X, Y, Z. And so to the extent that I worked with him from a distance, I really appreciated the humanity of it. And as a young YP administrator who was still trying to find his feet, he was a terrific resource and a wonderful human. Thanks.
And I'm one of those who worked with Tony but didn't know him anywhere near as well as some of you. It was a pleasure being able to talk with him one-on-one. You always learned something. He knew so much. He thought rigorously. He cared a lot about people. But one thing that struck me from all of this conversation this afternoon is, you know, Tony embodied an awful lot of what we have admired as the kind of spirit of the World Bank. He was an economist, and a very good economist, so he understood economic principles. He was very rigorous. But unlike some economists, he thought that the facts were important. Unlike some economists, he thought that the institutions and country situation, that they were important as well. Unlike some economists, he thought that people were important. And he accumulated a lot of experience on the economic side, thorough understanding of infrastructure, on the interpersonal side, but always with what several of you have mentioned of someone who always asked questions, always had an open mind. So, you know, Tony was a wonderful person, a wonderful professional, and he also, I think, embodies an awful lot of what has made this institution what it's been.
Well, that was a wonderful way to conclude your remarks, because I always saw Tony as a real embodiment of the World Bank. I'm Joan Churchill. Tony and I were married in 1974. He came to the bank in 65, so the World Bank was already a large part of his life when, so I sort of married Tony and the World Bank at the same time. I want to thank all of you for being here. It's just so wonderful. I especially want to thank Marcelo for suggesting this event, for Luis for carrying a lot of the, Luis Landau for doing a lot of the work to get it organized. I want to thank you, Inder, for making the arrangements so it all came came about. Something I thought was particularly interesting to share with you is, I think back to before Tony and I were married, before we were, it was before he and I were an item or whatever, the current phraseology. He had befriended my father, and my father had a speaking group that he was involved with, and he invited Tony to be a speaker at it. And my father invited me to attend it, and I remember very clearly how prescient Tony was, because he was talking about the prospect of the availability of resources, particularly gas, in the future. It was about the time when we had to wait in long lines to fill our cars with gasoline, and everybody was worried that gas was going to disappear and that we weren't going to have enough 30 years later. And this speech was over 40 years ago. Yesterday would have been Tony and my 41st wedding anniversary. So it was more than 41, 42 years ago. And he was very reassuring to everybody in the audience, telling us that the gas was not going to run out in 30 years. Marcelo, you mentioned that, the availability of technical changes, and I mean, he said both that new supplies would be found and also that people would shift. There'd be technological advances. We wouldn't need resources or gas in the same way. And everything he said came about, and here we are 40 years later, 42 years later, and we seem to have plenty of gas on the horizon. Prices have been going down lately or stabilized. So it's that was something that stuck out in my mind all these years. Tony talked, just a couple observations I had. I didn't know much about the details of Tony's work, his professional life, and that's why this is such a wonderful opportunity for me and the family to learn about that side of Tony's life. In the early days when I was first married to him, he was involved with the urban department, and I remember his reference to the need when you're doing urban projects to provide the most you could for the most people, but making sure that it wasn't unaffordable. So he explained to me that a lot of the projects involved going in, giving people just a concrete slab with a sewer hookup, and that they would then over time build their own homes around it. And he described for me that many of the governments considered this politically unacceptable. They wanted the best for their people. They wanted people to be able to be given, a much more developed type of housing. But he explained that from a cost analysis, this way you could get housing to the largest number of people, and that people would eventually build their own houses. They had a stake in it, and they'd make sure that they built their houses. I remember his comments I found a little surprising about subways. We were building the DC metro system in those days, and he was rather skeptical about subways. He felt they're very expensive, and people would really rather drive cars places. Metros don't go where everybody wants to go. So that was sort of interesting. I don't know if there haven't been metros much. Another family thought I've had over the years is my own father was involved with both housing and energy, and I just sort of wonder about how did it come about that I married somebody whose career, the earlier part of it involved housing and the latter part of it involved energy. My father was one of the people who was one of the first people who was sounding the alarm about the dangers of nuclear energy. As I thought the rabbi put it cutely, I organized play dates between my daughter and Rebecca, who are exactly the same age, and eventually their play dates turned into play dates between between Tony and me. I just think this has been such a wonderful opportunity, especially for myself and especially for the children and grandchild, to learn about Tony and his professional life. Not something that family is really that aware of. Thank you all so much. You've all been wonderful support to me. I've gotten so many messages, and I haven't yet sent out my acknowledgments, but I want you all to know that I very much appreciate it. I've made a list. Jacob helped me with the list. I'm going to get to it, and I'll be responding to everybody. Thank you so much for all your support in this difficult time.
Thank you, Joan.